The year is 1949. Oldsmobile decides to shake up the automotive world by building the first mass-produced, modern, short-stroke, high-compression, overhead valve V8. Oldsmobile would offer the Rocket, as the engine would be called, in 2 generations. In this episode, we are only going to cover the first generation, which was produced from 1949 to 1964. The second generation was produced from 1964 to 1990. First generation Oldsmobile Rocket 88 was designed by Charles Kettering. For those who may have never heard of this man, this guy was an absolute legend, founder of Delco, inventor of the electric starter, unleaded gas, Freon, as well as many other inventions. Just to be clear, for those keeping score, it took GM 17 years to answer the Ford Flathead V8, and GM was going to start a domino effect that they didn't really foresee, overhead valve craze. And to be fair, overhead valve isn't a new thing. They've been doing overhead valve from the very beginning. I'm wondering, did you guys ever notice this? Did you ever make this connection? GM kind of used Oldsmobile as their guinea pig brand. Oldsmobile got all the technologies before other brands. Don't believe me? Who got the first hydromatic transmission? Oldsmobile. Who got the first GM front-wheel drive system? Oldsmobile. Who got the first diesel V8? Oldsmobile. I know that was a bad one. We're still trying to forget about that one. Anyway, overhead valve was to be done both by Oldsmobile and Cadillac in 1949. Buick was overhead valve clear back in 1904. Pontiac and Chevy would go overhead valve in 1955. Overhead valve head provides a much better intake and exhaust flow, allowing a higher compression with a higher heat exchange and efficiency. So, a bit of a background story. Cadillac was lobbying Chevy to have the overhead valve V8 be exclusive to their brand, kind of like how Buick had overhead valve inline 8. Remember, GM had 5 brands that didn't share anything mechanical with one another. GM would give the green light to both Oldsmobile and Cadillac. Oldsmobile was making new cars like the future Ramic, and GM knew that there wasn't a future for the inline 8. That is what the new Oldsmobile Rocket V8 would replace. Rocket name was derived from the space race between the United States and the USSR. Side revelation, Cadillac got fins in 1949, Oldsmobile got the Rocket. Those two cars would set the stage for what the 50s would become. Big overhead valve V8s and fins. First generation Oldsmobile Rocket V8 has 4 engine displacements from 1 block size. In other words, there is only 1 block size, no small block, no big block, in 4 displacements. The 303, 324, 371, and 394. Introduced in 1949 and was produced until 1953, 303 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 5 liters. When doing these specifications, we are only going to cover the highest horsepower and the lowest horsepower. Just know it could fall somewhere in between there because every year they made various changes. We could be here all day if we talk about all of the changes they made year to year, especially on the later engines. 303 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 5 liters. It made 135 horsepower in 1949 with a 2-barrel carburetor. In 1953, it had a 4-barrel carburetor making 160 horsepower, 4,600 RPM. 250 pound-feet of torque in 1949, 265 pound-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM by 1953. Bore of 3.75 inches in a stroke of 3.4375 inches. Compression was anywhere between 7.5 to 1 to 8 to 1. This engine could be found in the Olds 88, Super 88, and Olds 98. The Olds 88 division called the original cars the Rocket 88s. In 1954, the bore was increased to 324 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve V8 5.3 liters. It was produced from 1954 to 1956. It could produce anywhere from 170 to 230 horsepower at 4,600 RPM, 295 to 350 pound-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM, with a bore of 3.875 inches and a stroke of 3.4375 inches, compression 825 to 1. The 324 has sort of a bad reputation for failing pistons. The cast skirts would separate from the steel interior brace. The problem doesn't usually occur until the motor has at least 50,000 miles on it. But that's a huge problem to watch out for on any 324 that is original that might have less than 50,000 miles and never been open. For 1957, both bore and stroke increased. Displacement to 371 cubic inch displacement. V8 6.1 liters. It's good for anywhere between 240 to 380 horsepower, 375 to 400 pound-feet of torque. This engine was used from 1957 to 1960. Bore of 4 inches, stroke of 3.7 inches. Compression could be anywhere from 9.25 to 1 to 10 to 1. Side note, in 1957 and 1958, this engine could be had with the J2 package, which entailed 3 two-barrel carburetors. It bumped compression to 10 to 1. 312 horsepower, 4,600 RPM, 415 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM. It's important to note that the J2 didn't use progressive carbs. The center carburetor was the carb that was doing all of the work. When the center was 60% open, the other two would open, meaning if you putt around town and you never drove this fast to open the other carburetors, the linkages would stick, and it wasn't uncommon for the throats to get clogged inside the carburetors themselves. Oldsmobile would only offer the J2 for 57 and 58, discontinuing it in 58 because of consumer issues. Moving on to the largest first-generation block displacement, 394 cubic inch displacement, V8 6.5 liters, is good for anywhere between 250 to 345 horsepower at 4,400 RPM. A very healthy 405 to 440 pound-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM. This engine was used between the years of 1959 and 1964 with a bore of 4.1 inches and a stroke of 3.7 inches. Compression is anywhere between 975 to 1 and 10.5 to 1. Oldsmobile would introduce the second-generation Rocket in 1964, and they would have a small block, which would be the 260, 307, 330, 350, 403, and a big block, 400, 425, 455. This second generation had a unique combustion chamber with valve angle of just 6 degrees. To put that in perspective for you, a small block Chevy had 23-degree angle and a Ford had 20-degree angle. Very open and flat chamber, which had a lower emission rate and returned decent fuel economy, making the second generation live all the way up until 1990 with carburation. But that's an engine episode for another time. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. Think of all of the cars that had the Rocket engine in it. What would you rather have? For me, it would have to be like a 1950 Oldsmobile wagon. Look at how sexy these look. Or is that just me? Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below or check out our Facebook group that correlates with this YouTube channel. I call it the After Party. I wish YouTube would give you guys the opportunity to share your ride stories and experiences, like sort of like a community bulletin board. That's sort of what the Facebook group is. If that sounds like something that's worth checking out, all of that will be linked in the description below. Just know I appreciate all of the support, and until next time, toodaloo!